This is not a question per se, but Gord Downey of the Tragically Hip at his last concert in Kingston last fall made a couple of statements. He said that we're not born as racists. We're not born to no discrimination. And he was making those comments in reference to the issue of reconciliation in Canada. And I guess what I would like to suggest, and I'm really interested in the last slide that you presented, because you had a picture of a young person. And I think that's really where it starts, is to build the environment, the cultural environment, so that our young people don't learn those racist values from the very beginning. Thanks.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Adam Bentley. I'm a planner in Alberta. I guess I'll introduce a brief context and then ask the question, I guess. So the salary study for planners just came out, and it showed that the average salary of an urban planner or a land use planner in Canada just surpassed $100,000. And so often when I feel like I'm attending these events, that I'm sort of, stuck in that bubble. And I imagine that if you've given this presentation a number of times to a number of different situations, I was wondering if you could talk about the variety of comments, questions, reactions you've had, and such. Any memorable ones as well.
Sure. I think oftentimes after I give a speech like this, there's very few questions because people either feel really bad or people are just sitting with it, and it's hard to come up with a question right after you're done. The other thing that happens a ton is people will come up to me and say things like, well, people hold their purse when they see me too because I'm so tall. And so there's that piece of it that's like, oh, well, you're making this about you, thank you. And so I get a lot of those comments. And then I think the number one thing is just like, what do we do, right? Like we're in this bubble. We're compensated fairly well for the work we do, and we have this tension where we want to think about these issues and we want to engage people, and at the same time we have deadlines and we have deliverables and we have metrics that we have to hit. And so I think people really struggle with how do I actualize this? What do I do about it? And what I always tell people is that there are small things you can do every day. And one of them is actually to take some time and just sit quietly with yourself and think about what are the things I can do every day. And so maybe it's not an infrastructure project. Maybe I'm actually gonna start to notice how certain people are treated in the workplace, and I'm gonna say something about that. Maybe I'm gonna notice that there's not a lot of diversity in who we're bringing in to work. And so I'm gonna do some time in my free time to do some mentorship of students in school, or to really help develop that pipeline. And so rather than thinking of it as this big issue, I always encourage people, think about what you can do in your everyday life and start small, because the small things help.
Is this working? Hello, my name is Tristan Cleveland. I'm from Halifax, and I'm a transportation advocate out there. It was really refreshing for me to hear you say that transportation work is oppression work. Back home, we don't have a single piece of dedicated transit infrastructure. And so, the Black community, but also any community in the city that really relies on transit to get around, we all benefit from them getting on a bus instead of getting in a car, because then there's more space for the rest of us, producing less pollution or costing less to serve them with the infrastructure. And what do we give them in return, these low-income people who are helping us all out by taking the bus? We make them wait for that bus. We make them wait on the bus in traffic. We make them transfer. There is actually no benefit for them making that choice, right? So it really is a question of justice to make sure that low-income people who are helping us all out also get helped out, that our infrastructure isn't only primarily going to the wealthy. But my question is, and I actually am getting to a question, the people sitting around the table among us advocates are mostly white people, right? And we're often having this funny conversation about a bunch of white people talking to white people saying, how do we get people who don't look like us in this room? And it's not just transportation, but the environmental movement in general. It's my question is, this is an issue that we see. It seems to affect communities so much that don't look like us, and yet it's mostly people, living in the core who are working on it. So how do we reach out to those people? How do we invite them to a table effectively and make them feel like this is their issue too?
I think in order to make folks feel like it's their issue, it has to be relevant to them.
Yeah.
And when you have a million other things going on in your community, sometimes going to a meeting isn't the top priority, right?
Yeah.
And I think the other thing we have to realize is, as folks who are often in these rooms, we often sit around and we're like, man, that was really great. How do we get more of those folks in this room? And the reality is, this is a conference in the middle of the day, in the core of downtown, for folks who are lucky enough to get some sort of compensation for being here. And so the thing we always have to ask ourselves when we're doing our work and we want to engage with people, and we're like, why aren't they in this room with us? Because this isn't their room. And why do we expect them to come to us? And so we have to ask ourselves, are we doing meetings at night? Are we doing meetings with daycare and free food? Are we doing meetings with translation services that are appropriate for everyone who's going to want to participate? Are we willing to go outside of our comfort zone to be with the people who we say we want to help or we want to hear from? Because I got to tell you, as a person who's not a planner or not an engineer and who looks like me, this room is really fucking uncomfortable. Like, this is not fun. People often notice that, like, after I do these talks, I'll talk to people and I'll hang out, and then I'll just, like, go back to my room and I just, like, need a minute to just, like, be black. Because this isn't necessarily, like, these aren't my people, right? Like, they've grown to be my people. Now when I go to these types of rooms, I start to see people I've met a lot of times. I have fun. I hang out more. I'll go to the happy hour after, right? Because I've built trust by being in the room and by getting to see folks. And so we have to be willing to build that trust. And sometimes that means realizing that we can't expect folks to come to our rooms and sit at our tables. We have to go to their rooms and sit at their tables.
Thank you.
Hi, this question's a little simpler, I guess, than some of them. But I work in a rural municipality, and in Canada, we've got depopulation of the rural areas. We don't really have the option for doing socially inclusive infrastructure like transit. It's not feasible. Bike lanes don't really work on gravel roads. People still want to walk their children outside. And we even have issues as simple as not having access to internet reliably, and that's a major economic disadvantage. So having your field of practice, as well as having lived in a place like Nebraska, do you have any suggestions for more depopulated rural areas for socially inclusive infrastructure, and what kind of would be the best investment for people?
I think it still comes back to the community engagement part. And so I think something I really realized growing up in a place like Nebraska is that folks assume if you're from a rural area, you're a hick, and that you don't care about the same things, that you don't want your kids to get to school safely, that you don't want to be able to get around and go, like, we have things to enjoy in small towns. We want to go and we want to enjoy them. And so, for me, at its core, the infrastructure is really going to depend on what the community wants. And so it's, again, how do you engage in that community? And oftentimes when we talk about engaging in the community in culturally relevant ways or linguistically appropriate ways, we think about what languages are people speaking. We think about, what cultures are people from. And for me, I always think about it as being from a small town in Nebraska. When I'm in my small town in Nebraska, there's a different way I talk to people. There's a different way I engage with people. There's a different pace at which I do things. And so I think, it doesn't matter what community you're in. Your success is always going to be tied to, are you doing the work you can do to really build up that trust and really make sure people know that you care about them. And that doesn't mean you're always going to do what they want. But you're at least then able to have a conversation about why you didn't do it, because you've taken the time to engage them and to make them feel like they are part of the process. And you're not the planner from up above saying, I'm smarter than you, we're going to do what we want. But you're really valuing what they bring to the situation.
Thank you. Next.
Hi, my name is Zainab Moghil, and I'm an adaptation and resiliency planner with Stantec Consulting based in Waterloo. Thank you very much for your engaging and insightful presentation. I'm wondering if you could share some example projects of your work in LA, which, as we know, has some very interesting transportation challenges and opportunities for increased sustainability. So I'd love to hear an example or two.
Yeah, one of our biggest challenges was in this past election in November. The county, so the LA County Bicycle Coalition, represents the whole county of LA. And the county of LA is 88 cities and unincorporated areas, so millions of people, right? The county of LA is probably big enough to be its own state. And we wanted to put a transportation sales tax on the ballot, which would mean that forever we would have money coming in to work on transportation projects. And it was this really tough fight because in LA, everyone cares about traffic, but people don't necessarily want another sales tax. And not just that, people are always worried that the big cities and not the rural or unincorporated parts of LA are gonna get all the resources. And so what we did is we helped advocate for the system called local return, so that every individual jurisdiction, based on their population, will get a percentage of the money back to do whatever they want with. And so that's the way we got everybody to buy in. And the people who didn't buy in were most often in communities of color or low-income communities. And that's because in LA, we have one of the biggest ports in the world in Long Beach, and there's a section of Southeast LA that is predominantly Latino, one of the most densely populated areas in the county, and there's a ton of environmental pollution just going through with freight movement through that corridor. And so those folks just had this fear that this money that was invested would get to them last, and not just that, it would just be used to build infrastructure that would further harm their community. And so that's kind of this constant struggle we face, that how do you get folks to buy into something that's really about improving their community and bringing in resources when their main fear is that that influx of resources is just going to create more pollution, create more chaos, or that it's infrastructure for people who haven't been there, that it's a way to spruce up the neighborhood so that new people would want to move in, and then those people who are low income are going to get pushed out. And so we really have to do a lot of engagement and a lot of these really long community meetings. And what was so tough about it is that we didn't have a lot of time because the ballot is the ballot and the election happens when it happens. And one of the things that went really well, there was a similar measure on parks and about having a sales tax for more parks funding. And what the Department of Parks and Recreation did is they partnered with a community group in every city, and they held these community meetings where the community got to help define equity. And they took the notes from all of these meetings, and that's how they decided where to prioritize funding and how to categorize what made the most sense. And so that was a really key success. Other things in LA, especially on bikes, we really struggle with parking. Everybody wants parking, so that's a huge struggle. We really struggle with who are bike lanes for. So in more affluent communities, everybody feels like we all have cars. That must be for those people. And in low-income communities, people are like, you didn't care about us before. Why are you putting in a bike lane? It must be to bring in those other people. So that's a constant struggle. And then one of my favorite in LA is the film industry. The film industry hates green bike lanes because they said it impacts what they're able to film, which I've never really understood because I feel like you always hear about the green screen in the film industry, but they hate green bike lanes. And they've also started to expand to say protected bike lanes, parklets, extended sidewalks, anything that makes it hard to make it seem like downtown Los Angeles could be anywhere in the world, they really fight us. So that is one of our more creative and difficult challenges. And it's weird, right? Because oftentimes our point of view is you really need to engage the community. We're not the experts, the community are the experts. But with the film industry, we're the experts. Why are you letting the film industry plan our streets? But that's something we really struggle with. And what we ultimately have learned is that it still comes back to that community engagement and storytelling. Because if we don't get people in front of the elected officials to say, this matters to me more than the film industry, like, then we lose. And we've had to realize that we really need diverse partners. AARP, our big senior organization, they're our best partner in many ways, because as much as you don't want to say no to the film industry in LA, you definitely don't want to say no to older people. They vote, they show up, and they have income, and they will send you 1 million emails. And so that's a group we really try to work with a lot.
Oh, at the back here.
Hi. Hi, my name is Glynis Buffalo. I work for the government of Alberta. I'm also from Samson Cree Nation. That's a First Nation about 2 hours north of here in Treaty 6 territory. So thank you for raising, a lot of the issues that I still face, like we face as Indigenous people. Like for instance, I've had people, and people I've worked with, like in planning, and there is very few Indigenous people who work in our field and in Alberta, like just saying things like, Glynis, how come so many of your people kill themselves? That's the question they want to hear from me. Or Glynis, how come you guys just don't get over it, about residential schools? So I'm happy that, this conference has been raising these issues like this. Just yesterday at the session that I moderated, we actually had Chief Lee Crowchild. He's the chief of Tsuut'ina Nation, which is just west of here. Anyway, so from my understanding, the presenter, Aaron Aubin, he said that we think that's the first time we've ever had a chief as a presenter in one of the sessions. Like, we've had chiefs, grand chiefs, open up the Alberta Professional Planners Institute conferences as a welcome to treaty, the territory that we're in. So I guess in terms of resilience, I was really excited, to hear that we're working hard, we're trying to build relationships. So I was like, that just doesn't happen. That just doesn't happen. So I also, I guess I wanted to raise that, as planners, CIP, that, I give thanks, thank you to CIP and APPI for the building, creating bridges that way with the First Nations here. So. So my question is, I guess it's two things. One thing is, related to residential schools. I'm sure people have probably questioned about when is it time to get over your stuff that happened in your history. I'm sure you face that. I've had somebody say to me, Glynis, I don't know if you've experienced racism just because of where I am today. And I'm like, what? Anyway, I didn't get into it because I just knew it wasn't the time. And I can tell that it wasn't the time to share and teach that person, at that moment. Anyway, so what is, I guess, your, when you're faced that, people ask about your history, when is it time to move on? But also, my other question is what in, how are, the celebrations that, we're moving towards resilience, what's been in your experience?
Yeah. Well, first, thank you for sharing. I really appreciate that, and I know it's not easy to be in a room of your peers and colleagues and be honest about how things they've said or done have impacted you. So thank you for that. Mm-hmm. And so, for me, people say that all the time, and especially in the United States, I think there's this impression that the folks who are of Asian descent have really made it, right? Mm-hmm. They're doing really well. They're doctors, they're lawyers, and that folks who are Latino, their population is growing, and especially in California, a number of our elected officials, a number of like our leaders are folks who are Latino. And the two areas where you see that there's not necessarily a lot of growth are Native people and Black people, right? And people always say like, well, they're making it, why can't you guys just get over it? And I think it's one of the most frustrating like questions that you ever get asked. And I often don't know what to say. I'm like, that's like you telling me like the world is flat. Like we can't even have a conversation. Like there's no place to start. If you are in a place where you think we should get over it, then you just don't understand. And there's so much more here than we could ever say, right? Because it's hard to get over something when it hasn't ended. And I think that's what people don't understand. There's always this feeling of like, well, I didn't enslave people. Well, I wasn't part of this, school program. Why are you still upset? And the reality is it hasn't ended. Because oftentimes as professionals, we like data and we'll look at stats and we'll be able to see that like rates of obesity, or rates of suicide, or rates of depression, or alcoholism, or any of these things are higher in the Black community and Native communities. Always, always, always. And so don't ask me to get over something when it's still happening. Because the impacts are still happening. You can't do something for so long and then just expect us to get over it. And it's not because we're not resilient, because we are, because we're still here, right? We are systematically being killed, Black folks, Native folks, systematically, through all systems, and we're still here. And not only are we still here, we still celebrate our culture, we still find joy, we still find happiness, because we're the most resilient motherfuckers y'all got. You need us. Right? And like, it's not just that. I think especially in this field, our whole job is to imagine things that aren't there. It's our job to imagine automated vehicles, which, it's our job to like imagine infrastructure where it previously wasn't there and to think about how it's going to change traffic patterns but make it better. It's our job to be imaginative. You know who the best people at that are? Native people and Black people. Because we had to imagine a life in which we'd be free from systematic killings. And we had to imagine that it could happen and keep going, waiting for that day. And we do it every single day. So you can't do your most imaginative, creative work if you're not including us. And then I think for those of us, no matter what group you're in that is marginalized, you have to practice self-care. You have to realize that you can't always teach everybody, and you have to unplug sometimes, and you have to be okay with the fact that today it's not your job. Yes. Today it's not your job to help them. And that's why we need more than allies, accomplices. Because we need somebody that when somebody says, Tamika, why can't you get over it? I need my white wife to be like, I got this, boo, right? Because like I can't always do it. We have really hard conversations in our family because her parents are Canadian and they have a different perspective of racism in the United States because they're not from the United States and they didn't grow up in the United States. And it takes a lot of patience. And so I need an accomplice. I need to know that there are people on my team. And so that's what we all need. We need to know that it's okay sometimes to not have to be the ones who explain it. And you can't put one of us in your work group or one of us on your team and then be mad when we don't do it because we need help.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Carrie Idland. I'm from Alberta. I am a blonde, blue-eyed woman. And I've worked in a few different smaller municipalities around the province in my career so far. And often when I get up in front of council, it's people who look very much like my parents or grandparents. And the communities that I'm working in typically have a smaller population of what I'll call identifiable minorities. And I was just wondering if you could speak to some of your experiences on, you touched very briefly on buy-in with one of your other answers, but getting that buy-in from council, because planners work in a very political sphere. And often if I say, well, we have refugee families, and maybe we'll consider getting a translator, or we have whatever other group, and they're like, oh, well, There's like 10 of them.
Right.
So if you just
Yeah,
have
so
any experiences.
I think often in this world we think about policy advocacy, and it's because so much of our work is political. So much of it is getting buy-in from the elected officials and the folks with the resources. And so some folks know I'm actually going to another job shortly. I'm going to be leaving the Bike Coalition, and I'm going to be at another planning job, but it's about building parks. And the reason that feels different to me is because we have money from the government to build parks. And so the government puts out a request for proposal, and then my new organization will say, all right, we can build that park. And so that gives us a little bit more control over how to engage people because we're building the park. It's different in transportation. For so many of us advocacy groups or for folks working in government, we're not the ones actually, building the things with our resources. We're like going to people and saying, give us the resources to do what you're allowing us to do. We're gonna tell you why we should do it, but give us the resources to allow us to do what you ultimately will decide if we can do. And that makes it a little more difficult because you need that buy-in. And so I always say you have to think beyond policy advocacy and you have to think about organizing. And that's really tough for wonky policy people. That's really tough for wonky engineers and planners. But if you don't organize your community, then they're not going to put the pressure you need. And at the end of the day, we have some really good folks in our government system who we have a lot of off-the-record conversations with, who will call us and say, this is what I need. I need you to show up at this hearing. I need you to bring people. I need you to bring stories. And so I think it's really incumbent, even though you're working for a certain agency, how are you thinking about organizing and how are you thinking about mobilizing? And then how are you identifying the key community partners who can do that work and engaging them and building that trust and making sure that they're there when you need them and that they trust that you'll do the same for them.
Thank you.
Thank you. My name's Scott Piskevich. I'm with the Salty Land Use Planning Board in the Northwest Territories. And if you look at the map that's out there, I'm the far dot way up by the Arctic Circle, with nobody else around me. Appreciate your background that you put up there. I'm from Southern Illinois originally, so yay Midwest. My job before I came to Canada was a scuba dive instructor. And so, a lot of people think, why would a guy from Illinois be a scuba dive instructor? But then I asked, why would a guy from Illinois that's a scuba dive instructor be a executive director for Land Use Planning Board in the Northwest Territories?
I've asked that same question just now in my head, yeah.
And so the reason I raise this is, again, it's probably less of a question for you, but more for kind of a challenge to the room, because this is the first time in 5 years that I've participated in one of these events. And, whether it's urban planning, the issues that you've kind of raised, or rural areas where we don't have quite as many planners, in the north, where we have hardly anybody working in planning. There's these fringe elements of kind of land use or planning that haven't really been raised forward. And I think it's like growing as an organization. I think it's not so much an issue that's holding us back from addressing this, but I think it's actually an opportunity to reach out to other types of planners, other types of fringe areas to bring those people forward. And I just want to thank you for your presentation and kind of raising these issues. And again, I think maybe if I do have a question is, how does an organization like this kind of, when a fringe or a small element, how do you encourage it and how do you get it to grow and how do you get it to move forward?
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I think I still want to talk to you later about why. But I think what you have to do is just the things that some folks have mentioned here, right? So often we think about like, well, public health is important. Let's do a panel on public health. Or, well, environmental justice is important. Let's do a panel on environmental justice. But it's really at the core of all levels. Are you doing just a panel, or are you saying, it would be really interesting if we had on every panel and every workshop somebody who just wasn't from our field, if we were constantly thinking about it. And so I think oftentimes we like to segregate certain issues off, which isn't surprising because we're all about planning cities, and cities are all about segregating the part off that's a little different, right? It's all about ghettoizing certain aspects of the work. And if you really want to uplift something to be an integral part, then you have to include it at multiple levels. You have to include it in all the things you do. And so who do you have open up? but who do you have sit on a panel? Do you have gender neutral bathrooms throughout a facility so that everybody feels welcome? Do you not? Like, there are just, small things you can do so that even if you're not always talking about the issue, the folks who can bring those perspectives feel comfortable in the space, and then making sure you include it throughout various aspects of the program, and making it front and center as a core value, I think is always a great first step.
Okay, our last question from the floor.
Hi, TJ Auer, new to Alberta and a community social planning coordinator. Thank you for your presentation. That was phenomenal. When you're talking about transportation and the need to build up that political will, my core area is housing. And I've had the privilege to work in the Detroit area and see the lessons learned there. And I guess my question for you is, with all of the connections we know, even between public health and effective transportation, where complete community lessons have been learned over and over, and we've seen cities and our core areas bled dry by suburban developments, how do we get across when they ask for a road expansion or a new subdivision that is truly our upper middle class, most subsidized style of development, and most subsidized group or grouping in the country, that there's no debate about twinning a road lane, but all the debate in the world about adding another transit line when often the road is more expensive? How do we get that across to our political representation, that we need those complete communities?
Yeah, I think it's going back to that organizing part. And the thing I love the most about what you said is, oftentimes in this field we're thinking about complete streets, and nobody really cares about complete streets and communities. They care about complete neighborhoods. They wanna have the full package. They wanna know it's more than just their streets, it's these other aspects of work. And I think sometimes we realize that we have to be good at organizing and bringing in community members and bringing in stories. And so we turn to our transportation groups and we're like, okay, do organizing. But transportation groups aren't great at organizing. Like, we are not the best organizers at the LA County Bicycle Coalition, because we're wonky and we're nerdy and we like to ride our bikes. And in some ways, like riding a bike or doing other types of transportation, it's individualistic, right? Like, part of what we like about it is that we can be self-sufficient. And so when you think about bringing in other people, it's kind of counterintuitive sometimes. And that's why I think this intersectionality perspective is so key, because how do you get elected officials to listen and have the will? You have a stronger coalition of people saying it's important. And you have a stronger coalition of people because you're talking to seniors. You're talking to parents at schools and PTAs and helping them understand. I don't think you can do transportation work anymore if you're not talking about the environment, if you're not talking about housing, and you're not talking about public health. You just have to, because all of those things matter. And if you look at, in communities, who's really good at organizing? Public health folks, housing folks, right? They are better at organizing. If you can get a public health agency to be on board, or organization, we partner with a few hospitals. They have patients, right? They have this captive audience and people with stories. And that's compelling. It's compelling when a doctor comes in and testifies because they're a doctor and we like doctors, right? And because they have their own networks. And so often, to build that will, it's not just organizing the communities who would care, it's about thinking about the other intersections of where the work impacts and being able to bring those folks in. Because we're having this problem right now. Our biggest champion in LA, our biggest council member, he's from a more affluent district. And he put in a protected bike lane that has changed people's commute down one particular street from 5 minutes to 7 minutes. And they have started a petition to kick him out of office. They have passed a motion in their local neighborhood council. They've done all these things because in these more affluent communities, they have the means to ask for what they want and to request projects that are more expensive, but not necessarily as inclusive. And so the only thing that's gonna stop this, very dedicated group, but small group, is if we do a better job of bringing in different people. We have to bring in the businesses. We have to bring in, all these different types of folks, because that's who's going to help us against the folks with means. If you can get committed groups of folks from different sectors, that often helps.